Okay, so the title is Big Data and the Anthropocene. So, premièrement, qu'est-ce que c'est Big Data? J'ai essayé de trouver une traduction pour ça. Et le meilleur que j'ai pu faire, c'est mégadonnées. Mais ça n'est pas une bonne traduction, honnêtement, parce que l'idée de Big Data, c'est pas seulement avoir beaucoup de données, mais c'est l'idée, c'est une méthodologie, c'est une façon de penser à faire de la recherche. So big data is not only the data set, but also the whole systems and the methodology. So secondly, the concept of the Anthropocene. This is this idea of a period in geological history when the human impact is so ubiquitous that it's a major force in Earth evolution. And the idea here is that even after humans are long gone, the impact of this will still be seen in the fossil record. So I'm going to give you an example of looking at the question of big data and how it can be applied to geography. So we're going to ask a specific question. Have past environmental changes impacted human populations? And, or the same question, perhaps, have past human activities impacted the environment in a measurable way? Donc, pour faire ça, on a besoin des données. Et on a besoin des données quantitatives du climat du passé, de végétation du passé. On a besoin des données quantitatives de la densité de la population. And then we need to relate these two in some way, in time, in space, and in space-time. And then we have to explain the association. So I'm going to show you the data. I'm going to show you the methodology. And then I'm going to show how big data enters into this whole thing. So first of all, what's the question we're asking? So here's an example from Russia, where we can see on the right-hand side, 3 columns. This is the standard cultural picture that the Russians have worked out for what happened. This is in the region of the Volga. And then you can see that as part of this, when they were transitioned, there were periods of depopulation and relocation. And what's interesting is that these all correspond in a qualitative way with the transition between the major climate periods, Little Ice Age, Medieval Warm Period, Dark Ages, Cold Period, and Roman Warm Period. So maintenant, la question, c'est est-ce qu'on peut aller plus loin? Est-ce qu'on peut quantifier cette relation pour montrer bien qu'il y a une association avec des changements environnementaux et les populations ou les cultures? So the data we use, here we have, first of all, vegetation data. And paleovegetation data. The map you can see on the left-hand side, every point has a pollen diagram, and the pollen diagram you can see on the lower left-hand side. So this is just, the percentages over time. The y-axis is time, the percentage of spruce, birch, alder, and so on at this particular site. Because we have a spatial array of these data, we can then map the various taxa. We can see that on the right-hand side. So here you have, for the first column is oak, and then what's this? Walnut, then hickory, and then maple. Et on peut voir ça c'est tous les 2000 années, on peut voir la distribution de ces taxons en Amérique du Nord. So this is one of the data sets. Next, we need some paleoclimate data. And for this, we can use the same pollen diagrams. There's other data as well. So here we have the pollen diagram on the left-hand side. Here's the numbers you can see on the right-hand side. And we want to transform these pollen records into records of past temperature. For that, we use the modern climate patterns, the modern pollen, and derive a relation between the two and apply that relation down core to get the July temperatures. Nous avons discuté ça dans le cours de biogéographie et donc je n'ai pas besoin de parler de ça plus. Et regarde ici cet exemple des résultats. Chaque rangée, ici c'est une région dans l'Arctique canadien Et vous pouvez voir qu'il y a des périodes quand c'est chaud, quand c'est rouge, et les périodes plus froides quand il est bleu. Okay, so now the third data set, which is probably less familiar, is paleodemographic. This is human paleodemographic data. And what we have on the left-hand side is a map of North America. Every point is a radiocarbon date, which dated a settlement or a hearth or some charcoal or something like that that's associated with the human presence on the landscape. So you can see that there have been people all over. We know that. And any one point, this point could be 2,000, could be 4,000 years ago or whatever. And when we look at the histogram of what these dates are, you can see that on the lower right-hand side. So over time, there were fewer dates in the past, and then it went up over time. See, here's 0, the present, 16,000 years ago. So the population increased as you would expect. And this is just a smooth version of that. So there's not much going on at the continental scale. This is just a normal human increase. But when you look regionally, you can see that there's actually a lot more activity going on. So here's a recent study from the Arctic and Boreal of Canada. And using this database, here's all the data points. This is the actual histogram. So you can see the population was low, it then went up, and then it decreased. Around 3,900 years ago, remained low for 2,000 years, and then it increased. And I have to say that there's a whole methodology associated with this. We have to correct for taphonomy, we have to correct for sampling density, and so on and so on. But you know, you can see that in the papers if you're interested. OK, maintenant je vais donner deux exemples de recherche régionale. And we'll start with the northeastern United States. Here we have good data sets and an understanding of the vegetation and climate. So the question, is there an association between population and cultural changes and environmental changes in the region? OK, so ici sont les résultats. Les cartes montrent les datations de paléodémographiques ici en noir. Et ici sont les points où on a des données paléo-environnementales. Le graphique peut montrer sur le doigt, on peut voir ici, c'est le histogramme des datations pour cette région. So you can see that it was very low, went up. Again, there was a decrease after about 4,000 years ago, remained low, and then the population went up again. And these are colored by the standard archaeological, cultural, whatever they're called, cultural times, cultural periods in the past. Now, the late woodland, for example, is when agriculture came in, and so on. And this goes back many years in the archaeology. What's interesting here is that every major change in the archaeology is associated with an environmental change. Here we have an index of precipitation for the region. Here's an index of temperature here, vegetation change. And here we have the climate phases. These climate phases were defined back in the 1930s, actually. They were dated in the 1950s. And what you can see is that there's these major transitions that are shown in both the quantitative and in this more descriptive association. And every time that there is a major environmental change, there was a change in the population. These major demographic changes are associated with changes in the environment. So this is one approach we can use, and because we now have quantitative information about the population change, we can start to look at these kinds of associations at a regional scale. And I won't talk about these, but this is one example here from the Northeast. This was this recent study where we looked at the Arctic and the Boreal, the map I showed previously. So you can see here again, population increased, it decreased around 4,000 years ago. This lowermost here is the Beringia, the Yukon and Alaska. This is the Boreal Canada. This here is Arctic Canada. This is Greenland here. And you can see in all of these regions, there was a decrease here around 4,000 years ago, but not so much in the Arctic. And then here you had when in the Boreal, there was an increase in the population. Actually, people disappeared from Greenland for a period of several hundred years, and so on. And then you can study this and then analyze this. And currently we're working on a project looking at the prairie forest border, trying to understand fire history and human responses to vegetation and climate changes there. Now let's look at the inverse association. And nous pouvons aller d'Ontario. C'est dans le sud d'Ontario, on a commencé l'agriculture il y a à peu près 1000 années. Et donc, à ce moment, on a eu un changement de la culture, les villages et tout ça, et une augmentation de la population. On a vu ça dans le diapo précédent. So, la question maintenant, nous avons demandé, c'est est-ce que l'introduction de l'agriculture a eu et le changement de vie associé avec ça a eu un impact sur les forêts de la région? Okay, so here is the data. Each of these points is one radiocarbon date. That means there was a settlement there or something. And the red ones are those that have index of agriculture with them, as well as just an index of a person being there. Okay, so we take those population data this year and just made the density surfaces that's shown in here. Blacker is, more higher archaeological site density. So we took the pollen diagrams from the areas of high density. Those are those in red. Et aussi les diagrammes polliniques des régions qui n'ont pas une grande densité de la population, si en vert. And we took the average of these, and then we made the average of these and compared them. So here we go with the results. Here in the upper diagram is the red ones, all of these diagrams here, with the high population where there's also evidence of agriculture, and the lower, the green one, is where there's less evidence of this. These taxa here are those that are affected by climate change, and you can see that after about 1200 years ago, pine and spruce increased sort of at both of these regions, and maple and beech decreased. This is due to the little ice age. C'était bien connu. Ce type de résultats, on trouve partout dans la région, dans le Saint-Laurent, dans les Maritimes et tout ça. Ça, c'est l'impact du climat, le petit âge glaciaire, période médiévale ici, chaud, et le petit âge glaciaire ici. Now, if we look at disturbance taxa, we get a different story. Here we have this region with agriculture. Here's the evidence of agriculture, anthropogenic indicators. And here we have corn pollen in the pollen diagrams. There's none here. And there's little evidence of anthropogenic disturbance in these sites here where there's a low population density. What happens here is in the sites where we have evidence of agriculture, you have an increase in oak and poplar. Oak is an early successional taxa. Poplar is a disturbance taxa. And so over the period of nearly 1,000 years, you had an increase in oak and poplar in regions with high population density that you simply didn't see in regions with low population density. So what this is saying is that with une petite population, quand on a eu l'introduction de l'agriculture, il a eu un impact measurable sur la forêt. So this leads us to this whole idea of the early Anthropocene, l'Anthropocene précoce. These impacts, if they occur globally, could they have had an impact on the global climate before the Industrial Revolution? And dans les régions comme Asie, comme Europe, évidemment, avec des plus grandes populations, avec l'agriculture pour plusieurs mille années, il y a un impact. Mais la question, c'est dans l'Amérique du Nord, Amérique du Sud, est-ce qu'on peut voir un tel impact aussi? So in order to now do a global analysis, we have to move from these regional, which is sort of standard data analysis, to what we'll call this sort of big data approach. Okay, so here we have the basic data that we have. I've showed you these. This is the distribution of population of oak, of the nuts, trees, of maple. And here you can see sort of the density and the distribution of these trees over time. Here's a comparable map from the radiocarbon data showing the density of radiocarbon dates spatially now through time from 12,000 years ago to the present. And you can see the population increased over time. So these are the basic data sets we want to ask now. Is there an association between the population density and the vegetation density? So we worked out a methodology to do this, and here's basically how it works. Here's the original map of population density. This is for one time period. This is the oak tree density, one of the taxa we used. So we simply extracted the data from the range of oak. We then looked at the spatial autocorrelation for this time period. This is for population. This is for oak. We actually produced one of these maps for every 100-year period, giving us 120 maps of population, 120 maps of oak. We computed the spatial autocorrelation for all of these, and then we put them into a heat map diagram here showing spatial autocorrelation through time. We then looked at the cross correlation of these maps as well, did that for every time period, 120 of these, made a map of that. Okay, so if let's say that the population is increased and people use the forest or they burn the forest, this should have an impact on the trees. And we should be able to spot this by looking at the spatial cross correlation. We did the same thing now for the changes from one period to the next. Here's the population, here's the oak, here's the autocorrelation, and then we did this for all 120 time periods. Here's the autocorrelation through time for population for the trees. And here is the cross correlations. But we not only did the cross correlations for the same time intervals, but at lags of 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, up to 1,000 years into the present and future. 120 cross correlations for every one. And then here's the heat map that shows them. And here's just some more different lags. And then we took these short lag periods here and plotted them here. This is population. Here is vegetation. And here's the cross correlation at the various lags here up to a plus or minus 1,000 years between trees and the vegetation. We did this for all 10 taxa. So we're talking about, 120 correlations and cross correlations times 4 or 5 lag periods, or I think it's up to actually 10 lag periods. And we did this for 10 time periods, giving us, tens of thousands of correlation functions, all summarized in this one diagram here. So the idea of big data is not only do you have large amounts of data, mais c'est aussi important d'avoir une façon de faire une synthèse de toutes les données que nous pouvons interpréter d'une façon ou l'autre. And here's just one example for oak. Here's the oak range population, the changement dans une période de l'autre de chêne, les populations aussi. Ça, c'est seulement des exemples toutes les 2000 années. On a fait ça pour chaque 100 années. Et ici sont toutes les données, tous les résultats, les autocorrelations, the cross correlations, and all of the cross correlations for the various lags summarized in this diagram here. So we went through this whole exercise. The question was asking, do we see an association between vegetation and population changes at a continental scale? And the answer is not really. We couldn't identify one. So there's several possibilities for this. First of all, there's population was too small to have a measurable impact, or the lifestyle and the cultures and the technologies were, how do you say it, in tune with nature, in the sense that the ecological footprint was small enough so it didn't have a major impact, or the impact was only at a regional scale. And the other possibility is simply that the methodology and the data simply is unsuitable for asking the question. So maintenant, dans l'avenir, travail en cours, nous avons fait plusieurs études en Amérique du Nord, mais ce type de banque de données des datations radiocarbone sont disponibles pour plusieurs régions du monde. Il y a un bon commencement d'avoir une banque de données pour l'Amérique du Sud, en Europe évidemment. Il y a en Australie, il y a une très bonne banque de données aussi. Et donc, notre plan pour les prochaines 5 années, c'est de faire les types d'analyses que j'ai montrées à l'échelle globale pour essayer de voir si on peut quantifier la relation entre la population et les changements environnementaux dans le passé. OK, c'est tout. So there
Thank you,
it is.
Konrad. That was amazing. Thank you so much for that presentation. Yeah, big round of applause or behind your screens. So does anyone have any questions to start us off here? I mean, I have questions. This is my field too, so I could listen to Konrad talk about this all day. Okay, I guess I could start us first. I don't see any.
I have a question, but if you want to start first, that's fine too.
Go ahead,
okay.
Sydney, go ahead.
Okay, well, my question was just, well, I have a lot of questions, but I'll pick one. Near the end, you were talking about, reproducing this kind of project on a global scale. As you know, I study paleoclimate in the Caribbean, and as you mentioned to me once, there's not a lot of available pollen data, like the spatial resolution's pretty bad. I'm sure that's the case in other places in the world. As well, like there might not be a lot of archaeological evidence in a lot of places. So I'm wondering how you can, for example, you mentioned you use fire history to indicate human activity. So how do you, in those cases, make the relationship to human activity rather than, for example, like a changing climate that caused more natural fires?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's the question. And there's no answer to it. That's why the strategy that we use is we, at the same time, trying big data approaches and also regional approaches. Typically, you do the explanation at the regional scale and you try to set up hypotheses at the global scale. The data is extremely irregular, as you mentioned. There's some areas without it, and there's nothing we can do about it. On the other hand, one thing that we found was that there's a lot of data out there that simply hasn't been put into the databases. And once it gets in there, it's surprising what we could do. As an example, in Michel Brier's thesis, the Arctic one, no data from Greenland had been put in. But Michelle simply got the data, and she took about a couple months to do it, and she put together the Greenland database. And all you need to do is get people in various parts of the world to put together the data that's available. And then the next thing that this does is it, in fact, motivates people to go into and get the new data. So this is part of a really sort of an interactive long-term environment research program that we try to get people involved in, where we sort of answer and ask questions at the same time.
Yeah, that's interesting. And a bit of a follow-up question. Do you consider implementing XRF data into this analysis to sort of compensate for the missing anthropogenic or archaeological or pollen data?
Yeah, for the paleoclimate data, I showed the pollen data simply because that's what I work with. But now there's already a global database of all sorts of different climate data. And as we get more and more data, we use everything basically. Okay. This was just a very small subset of the kind of data that we use.
Cool. So Yulin, I think you can ask your question now. Thank you, Konrad.
Thanks, Konrad, for the presentation. Very interesting. The spatial scale is amazing. It's so large, and I wondered if your data comes from multiple sources. Do you guys have the same standard, data collection standard? And if not, how do you put data together if they have variations?
Yes, that's a big issue when we use multi-proxy. On the other hand, for the pollen data, the um, the methodology has been standardized since at least about the 1960s. And there's really only one way of doing it. And I think that is really a minor problem for that. On the other hand, you do get different climate data sets. As Sydney mentioned, you have XRF data. You have isotope data. You've got various paleolimnological data. And some of these are measured with, they have different resolution, they have different interpretations. The pollen data is quantified as July temperature. I haven't seen XRF data, you can correct me, Sydney, where it's been actually quantified to some sort of a temperature. So we have to just use, normal deviance or something like that. Honestly, I think it's something we need to think about, but I think it's a secondary problem, is the disparity between regions. I think the lack of data, just the irregular distribution of data is a bigger problem.
Thanks.
I think Mike has a question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Conrad. That was really interesting. I hadn't seen those before, and I'm just wondering about your cross correlation plots. Were you creating those based on the continuous surfaces that you had of pollen and or not of the Quercus pollen, for example, and population, or
I believe they extracted the gridded value at all the points.
right? Okay.
So the pollen records were first smoothed. This was, by the way, this was done by our German collaborators.
Okay.
I don't know if you met the guy. Did you?
I think so.
Yeah, he was a PhD he was doing his PhD in mathematics.
Right.
And this was his field. So, I mean, I would say, I would.
So they're not based on the maps, then, is what you're saying. The actual maps you were showing weren't just cross correlated. It was based on the observed locations and the cross correlation.
That's right. The extracted value at their locations.
Okay. I just wondering, the lack of signal might be due to spatial autocorrelation in those independent, each of the input data sets. And maybe if you tried it at an ordinal level, so you did a ranking instead, that might help decrease the let's say the influence of a large area that's not cross correlated, for example, because of spatial autocorrelation. So maybe trying that.
Yeah, when you looked at those heat maps, you see that it remains more or less highly correlated, which is a function of the smoothing function that we put into it. There's only the very small variations, which is what we were actually interpreting. And this is certainly a big problem. Okay. I think the thing is, this is the first time anybody had ever tried this at this kind of a scale. So we were just really trying to do experimenting to see if it worked. It didn't work very well. That's why we had to publish it in a very obscure journal. It was rejected by all the major journals.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Well, because we didn't find anything interesting, right?
Oh, well, that's interesting in itself, though.
Well, no, that's right. But nature doesn't take a paper that doesn't find a major impact of this. When you say people didn't have a major impact on the forest, or that it's regional scale, that's just not interesting.
Yeah.
But it also just the whole methodology, that the data is so noisy. And this is the other thing about big data. You get the results, but then you have to really know the data to look at it. And so, for example, just as a good example is castanea, the hemlock, the chestnut. That was a very rare pollen type, but it's an important one, so we had to look at it. But it's also very much influenced by just a couple of sites down in the Southwest, where I think it's even a different species of castanea, that kind of a thing. So it's really quite difficult to interpret this and to make sure that you're pulling a signal. And that's the whole problem with big data, because you have so much data, you have to summarize it. But I think when you're sort of in an intermediate data, as this is, you know, it does, you can do it. But I have to say, I studied these for a good 6 months to try to make sense out of the data.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I was gonna say I had a similar problem when I was in my undergrad, and a student in this department with, I think some of these professors might have been on the committee, did a paleotempestological database, so like hurricane study. And then as an undergrad, I tried to analyze that database, and I found it really difficult because there's discrepancy in how the data is presented, how long it goes back, and you really have to know what each study was trying to do before you can compare them as a whole. Anyways,
Right.
I see
Wait,
Mark.
but let me just follow up on that. That's an
Yeah.
example where you have to use statistical data analysis and not big data analysis.
Right.
And statistics has all of these tools that have been derived in order for you to understand messy data. The other thing is big data was designed for things like DNA databases or, you know, search data on the internet, which are relatively clean compared to environmental data.
Right.
So big data is only one tool that we would have in our toolbox, along with all the other statistical data analysis in order to make sense out of data.
Mm-hmm. Mark, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Let me just, yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Konrad. Really interesting. I love to see all these data, you know, real data and great maps. It's impressive, you know, how much digging went in there. I just a very quick comment and then a question. The comment is, you know, I'm really impressed that you did all this work and then concluded there's no clear pattern, because most ecologists and other scientists I've seen who do that number of correlations and that number of maps will just fish out the one that looks like a pattern and then publish that. You know, once you have hundreds of maps, one of them must look interesting. So really congratulations of showing that restraint. My question is about human transportation and human associated transportation of biologicals. So, you know, humans move, they bring corn from Central America, they bring pathogens of plants, you know, Dutch elm disease, etc., which have huge impacts on populations of trees, potentially. They could also bring animals that transport, you know, animals that eat acorn and suddenly increase the transportation of oak massively because of a new vertebrate species, a bird species, etc. Do you have any way in these data to investigate these questions of invasiveness of the plants you're studying, or their antagonists, or their symbionts?
Okay, first, I do, and I'll share the screen on this, but to answer your first point, I was really pressured by the co-authors to find a signal, I have to say. And we did dig around as much as we could, but in the end, it's simply not there at that scale. Okay, take a look at this. This is the map of juglans. What's that? The walnut. Okay, this is the distribution of it. And you see these points here in New York. I'm sorry it's so small, but this is what I found on the net. See those points there? Those are actually areas north of the range, but those are associated with villages, Iroquois villages. And a number of years ago, this map was done, by the way, back in the 1950s and 60s. And it's based on, this is the standard USDA forestry distribution of this taxa. It's a standard one. And then it was only a few decades later that an archaeologist was looking at that and said, hey, wait a minute, those outliers all through here are all associated with major villages. So the hypothesis is that these were actually planted, that they were traded north of the range, you know, bringing baskets of these nuts up the river, and then some of them were either planted or escaped. So that's, I think, an example, and it's an obvious example, and there must be other ones as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did you know that NRCan has a program for so-called assisted migration of trees up north? That's the idea is that the trees don't move fast enough to satisfy the needs of forestry. and therefore humans should assist climate change adaptation of trees through assisted migration of trees. Just mentioning.
Yeah, well, you know,
So,
what could possibly go wrong, I guess.
hey,
Yeah.
thanks.
Mike?
Yeah, just the map of walnut seems to be off. It looks like black walnut map, not just a general, like Euglena sincera, for example, which is native in our region. White walnut, butternut.
Yeah, I just quickly pulled up that map. I'm not sure it's even the right one and all that.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay,
You
cool.
know, but I remember there was a paper about this by an archaeologist about 20 years ago. And so they mentioned that association.
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering if maybe walnut. I can't remember in the pollen record in Gatineau and stuff. How far back do you find it? Because in the highlands and in our region we got the white walnut. Of course, it's today it's many of them don't live to reproduce because of the walnut blight or whatever. But
yeah, those maps are in the paper. But it's only the juglans. We don't have the two species.
no, yeah, okay. Thanks.
Hey, Konrad, I
Okay.
have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, first I have a comment. So, we're developing a new master's program in the Anthropocene. So I just want to warn you, we can't accept your retirement anytime soon, because this is exactly the kind of stuff that we want to teach, right? So that was just my comment. I have a question that I hope is sort of general interest as well, which relates back to whether you're finding patterns or not. As you were showing that slide, I thought, multiple testing issue, which is general for any kind of big data analysis. So I just wonder if you could expand a little bit on what you did and how you decided whether you find a pattern or not.
Oh, okay, first of all, in terms of your general comment, as you know, that big scale stuff was from Michel's Chaput's thesis. So I think even if I do retire, we'll have somebody to teach that material. But in terms of all of those statistical questions, I'll just leave that off to our collaborators. And they've thought about it. And in this particular case, I think this was preliminary. It's sort of the first analysis. And yeah, there is the whole question of what is significant in this. We left that open. Basically, we were looking for things that could be ecologically explained. And that is what didn't come up. If I could just share my PowerPoint. This is the key graph down here, right here.
We're still looking at your internet page browser.
New share.
It does say black walnut. I noticed in your in the URL.
Okay, so okay, what do you see now? Do you see the?
Yeah, we see your PowerPoint now.
Okay, so it's this one here. This is in the actual paper. All of this, hundreds, dozens of pages of graphs was in the supplemental. The paper only included this. Oh shoot. And I'm saying what we were looking for is like prolonged periods of red, high autocorrelation, which were sort of, could be explainable by thinking about what was going on. And that's what we didn't really see. So I think it's still, it wasn't done rigorously, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay, thanks. That's a really interesting perspective actually, because everything else is done so rigorously, and then you come to the interpretation and it's sort of a little more soft, I guess.
But it's not clear to me that the theory is sufficiently developed in order to understand the significance, Or if you'd have to do it, you'd have to do it using some sort of a Monte Carlo approach. And it's not clear that we'd have the computational ability to do that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I just think it's an interesting perspective to also kind of think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for all the questions. That was really great discussion period. It is 12:43, so unless there's any more quick comments, I would like to thank Konrad for this really, really interesting lunch and learn.